Welcome to The Landscape, your show about America's parks and public lands. I'm Aaron Weiss with the Center for Western Priorities. On a dreary day with a little rain and a little snow, but we definitely need the moisture. I'm flying solo for this one, but you will hear from my colleague, Lilly Bock-Brownstein, in just a minute. She joined me for this second part of our look at what's going on along the borderlands. In our last episode, we talked with Lakin Jordahl from the Center for Biological Diversity. Head back one episode in this feed to listen to that. Today, we're talking to Bob Krumenaker. He is the former superintendent of Big Bend National Park, and now he's the chair of Keep Big Bend Wild, a group that's at the front of the fight to keep the Trump administration from building a border wall straight through the park. But first, a quick news update. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum went before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee on Wednesday to defend President Trump's fiscal year 2027 budget request. It was a bumpy ride. The budget proposes a 13% cut to Interior overall and a nearly 40% reduction to the National Park Service's maintenance budget. Senator Angus King of Maine had a question about that.
Your budget cuts maintenance in the parks by 38%. What the heck? All this talk about maintenance and how we got to have maintenance and doing everything, and your budget's cutting by more than a third. Explain that one.
Well, I will just summarize Burgum's rather stumbling answer. He said the federal government is inefficient at doing maintenance projects, so it's actually just fine to keep cutting that maintenance budget. He told a story about a 2-mile road washout at Theodore Roosevelt National Park that took 6.5 years and $53 million to fix, which, okay, that's not great, but how does it follow from there that spending less on maintenance would make things any better? It certainly doesn't explain what happens to the other 430 park units with a $23 billion maintenance backlog after you cut their annual maintenance budget by 38%. And then there is the $10 billion question. The same budget request that is trying to slash park maintenance by nearly 40% includes a $10 billion Presidential Capital Stewardship Program for Washington, D.C. Senator King asked Burgum directly. Interior's own estimates put the deferred maintenance backlog for D.C. at around $2 billion, so what's the other $8 billion for? Well, Burgum stumbled and said, well, that $2 billion number, it understates the real need, and this is about the whole capital region, not just the National Mall. Well, that math doesn't math either. Even if you add in all of Virginia and Maryland, you only get to $4 billion in the official Park Service deferred maintenance database. So Senator King pressed Burgum, is any of that $10 billion going to the proposed triumphal arch at Memorial Bridge? Burgum said no. King made him say it twice on the record. Now, here's some context for that claim. The New York Times reported this week that the same construction firm that's building Trump's White House ballroom was also handed a secret, no-bid contract from the Park Service to repair 2 fountains in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House. The Biden administration had estimated that at about a $3 million job. The Trump administration just paid $17 million to the same contractor without seeking any competing bids, citing an urgency exemption that normally is reserved for wars, natural disasters, like actual emergencies. 2 firms that have actually worked on D.C. fountains told the Times that those Lafayette Park fountains are among the simplest in the city to fix. So, we've already got $17 million just for 2 fountains across the street from the White House. And Burgum wants us to believe that the other $6 billion he can't account for in his $10 billion request is just deferred maintenance and not a slush fund, even though he doesn't have a single spreadsheet that pretends to say what he would spend it on. That's the bottom line. Burgum has already spent $17 million in taxpayer money on a fountain outside the president's window. Trump has made it clear he wants more vanity projects, from giant arches to sculpture gardens. So as we said yesterday, it is time for Doug Burgum to tell the president that all of America's parks deserve the same attention, not just the ones that Donald Trump can see from his golden throne off the Lincoln bedroom. Today, we're joined by Bob Krumenaker, a 40-year veteran of the National Park Service who retired in 2023 after serving as superintendent of Big Bend National Park in Texas. He is now the chair of Keep Big Bend Wild, a nonpartisan group that advocates for protecting the national park. Bob, welcome to The Landscape.
Thank you, Aaron. It's terrific to be here.
So, in our last episode, we talked to Lakin Jordahl from the Center for Biological Diversity about the broad threats to public lands posed by border construction and the militarization that we're seeing. We briefly touched on this controversy regarding a potential border wall inside Big Bend. Beyond the physical footprint, obviously, why is the prospect of a border wall at Big Bend National Park so alarming to you and the Big Bend community?
Big Bend National Park is one of the wildest places in the lower 48. So there's just this visceral, oh my God, change. If nothing else, having the infrastructure of a border wall, the associated roads, and we'll talk more about what those impacts would just change the character of the place completely. It's also a totally unnecessary thing from a border security point of view, and I imagine we'll talk about that as well. Big Bend is one of the least visited traditional national parks. And when people get there, probably anytime other than spring break, which is a bit crowded, I think they revel in the fact that you can see almost nothing, despite the fact that there's a fairly well-developed infrastructure there. When you go to the border, the Rio Grande, it forms 118 miles of the border of the park as well as the country. You're looking across at Mexico, and frankly, it looks exactly the same on the other side, and that's one of the charms of being there. So, I think the simplest thing to say, Aaron, is it would change the nature of the place completely. And, if it was actually necessary for border security, we might be able to make some argument that we could live with that, but it's not necessary either.
Let's go ahead and drill down on that. In your time as superintendent of Big Bend, were illegal border crossings a big issue? I mean, is there a justification? Could there be a justification for needing a barrier there to prevent illegal crossings?
There were definitely illegal crossings in the park, and I will acknowledge they continue, but the numbers are minuscule and the existing security systems work. There's a Border Patrol substation inside the national park, and the Border Patrol agents are partners with the National Park Service on many things beyond border security, including search and rescue. They're force multipliers for the Park Service. They were good neighbors. And it was my impression, and I have testified before Congress to this point, that the existing systems worked. So in the last couple years, the Border Patrol has shared data from the number of apprehensions inside the national park, inside Big Bend, and it's been between 100 and 200 people a year. And while that's not zero, the Border Patrol has always told us that they were confident that just about everybody that did cross was apprehended. And frankly, in my experience, most of those who did cross there voluntarily gave themselves up. There's also check stations on the major highways that leave the park. And so anybody that comes through the park and braves the desert, this is a really, really difficult place on both sides of the border to cross. Almost everybody is caught. So there's also a lot of technology in the park. And so existing systems work. And that's not just my opinion, but that's what the sheriffs from the local counties and the politicians from the local counties, more of whom are Republicans than Democrats, just about everybody believes that border security in this area is important. But this is the least trafficked area in the entire United States border, and existing systems are working just fine.
So let's take a step back, because I'm guessing a lot of our listeners have never visited Big Bend. I've never visited Big Bend. Can you describe what the area looks like, what the landscape's like out there?
Well, for those watching on YouTube, there's a picture from the south rim of the Chisos Mountains behind me, and that view of high desert and mountains is a typical view. Big Bend is the seventh or eighth largest national park in the lower 48. It's over 800,000 acres, and it spans three major ecosystems. The Big Bend of the Rio Grande is what it's named for, so you can actually see Big Bend National Park from space because you can see the canyon and the path of the river. But the park is nestled in that big U shape of the Big Bend. And so 118 miles of river form a riparian corridor. And while the river is not what it once was in terms of the amount of flow, about 60% of that is in deep canyons as deep as 1,500 feet. You've got vegetation down there and more moisture, of course. So it forms the biggest and most diverse number of bird species in any national park. But then you've also got vast expanses of mid-elevation desert that this is the Chihuahuan Desert. So it's actually a greener and more lush desert than what most people imagine in the country. Very biodiverse. You've got mountain lions and you have black bears and javelinas and a number of endangered and threatened species. And then the center of the park is the Chisos Mountain Range, a sky island that ranges up to 7,800 feet. So you've got about 6,000 foot elevation range, tremendous diversity in terms of the amount of rainfall and therefore the amount of habitats. But what's really interesting about Big Bend on top of all of this is that it's an old line national park dating from legislation in the 1930s and the beginnings of development in the 1940s. And so you've got a road network of paved roads and unpaved roads, and you've got 3 major campgrounds, 5 visitor centers, you've got a lodge and a restaurant. And so the amenities of a traditional Western national park. So if people want to visit and spend most of their time in or near their cars, they can do that. But you also have hundreds of miles of hiking trails and vast areas in between the roads that form not untrammeled wilderness, but really wild country that you generally can't see anything else that is a modern footprint of America. So it's more like southern Utah or other parts of the high desert than anywhere else in Texas. It's really a unique environment.
All right, so walk me through the counter argument then. You've got this very large park, you've got all this space, all these trails. So what if you put up a wall along the southern part of it? What difference would it make?
Well, first of all, the river is a key part of not just the ecosystem, but the visitor experience. And so there is a vast economy that exists in the gateway communities of river running outfitters. You have two of the 3 major roads in the park dead end at the river. So the river experience is a key thing. And you would be blocked from that. A wall would obviously be a visual impact, but it would also be a barrier that would stop people from approaching the wall. It would likely be lit at night, and Big Bend also has the darkest night skies in the lower 48. So even if you weren't looking at the wall, even if you were 20 or 30 or 40 miles away, odds are the sky glow from that stadium lighting along the river would be very, very impacting. Any wall that's big enough to stop humans would also stop big wildlife like black bears. It's one of the great conservation stories of Big Bend that black bears have recolonized the park coming across from the protected areas of Mexico. So we can go on, but it would just change the nature of the park. You wouldn't have to be standing looking at the wall to feel the impacts of the wall.
You're saying the black bears do not carry passports?
They do not. We don't check them on a regular basis.
So let's talk about your work with Keep Big Bend Wild. That coalition of people that want to protect this area, that includes environmental advocates, it includes conservative rural sheriffs, local business owners, and we've seen that coalition rise up protesting the idea of a wall in Big Bend. So how has this threat managed to bridge the political divide?
Well, let me back up a little bit. Keep Big Bend Wild formed in 2021 while I was the superintendent of the park. It's a coalition between citizens and the Park Service looking to get federal legislation for wilderness in those undeveloped areas of the park, something that the Park Service has been in favor of since the 1970s, but to be perfectly honest, hasn't gotten a lot of traction because for the most part, pre-wall, people were thinking, well, the park is well managed. It doesn't really need that, and getting legislation is really hard. Keep Big Bend Wild now, this is the most important issue to fight the wall because there's nothing that would destroy the wild character and arguably the eligibility for wilderness more so than the wall. I will say Keep Big Bend Wild is a part of this big coalition. We are not by any means the leaders. There are no leaders. It's a typical 21st century bottom-up coalition. But what's remarkable as you point out, Lilly, is that this coalition just crosses every traditional boundary you can think of. Arguably, it's being led by the county sheriffs from the 5 counties in the Big Bend area who are more Republicans than Democrats. These tend to be very conservative people. They have impeccable security credentials, and the county judges in Texas, that's what they call the county executives, are against it. More than 50 state legislators in Texas, mostly Democrats, but a few Republicans. Virtually every member of the Texas congressional delegation that is a Democrat. Unfortunately, none of the Republicans have spoken up. But on the other hand, none of the Republicans have actually come out in favor of the wall. So there's obviously a lot of politics behind this, and a lot of people, I think, are reluctant to speak publicly. But Big Bend, this coalition is remarkable. In my 40 plus years of working in public lands, I have never seen anything like this. People love the park. They love the area. They care about border security, but they don't think border security needs to destroy what keeps this area so special in order to do border security.
So walk me through then the potential pathways here, legislative, legal. Has this moment that is really bringing folks together across political divides, is this creating an opportunity potentially for legislation to say definitively, no, you won't build a border wall, and yes, there are some areas of this park that deserve a wilderness designation? I mean, have things changed over the last couple of months in terms of where things might go?
It's really remarkable, Aaron, because as I said, a few months ago, we were making slow progress gaining interest in the wilderness designation, but there was a lot of skepticism that it was possible to get that through a very conservative delegation in Congress, particularly in Texas. But the wall has changed everything. The remarkable coalition that has come together in support of the park, I will acknowledge it's not necessarily in support of wilderness, but the point that Keep Big Bend Wild is making is these things are closely related to one another. If there's nothing else we have learned from the wall fight, it's that this park that people thought because of its isolation and terrain was protected may not be as well protected as we think. So our hope is that by showing that we're all on the same team, we will be able to hold the coalition together towards legislation. I will say I was down in Terlingua, Texas, which is the tiny gateway community on the west side of the park a few weeks ago, and had numerous meetings with local folks. I am way more popular in Terlingua now than I ever was when I was the superintendent. Superintendents sometimes make decisions that local folks are not always happy with. But I hope we've built some street cred with them. We're in this fight together for sure.
And then what's the legal situation right now? Are there challenges potentially to this border wall? I know there was talk of a map, and then the map got revised, but maybe that didn't actually change anything on the ground. Just what's the current state of play?
Well, those are several questions all in one. The current state of play is unknown. As you point out, Customs and Border Protection has an online map. It's called the Smart Wall. I hate that term. But nonetheless, the colors change periodically, and they've changed at least 3 times in the last 2 months. So prior to middle of February, the color on the map was always one that showed detection technology only as the solution. And while we don't know exactly what that means, there's already a lot of detection technology. So that in itself is not frightening, provided that the future detection technology is built in a similar style to what's already there. But the map changed to showing a complete planned border wall up and down the Big Bend area in the national park, the Wild and Scenic River downstream, the state park upstream, and a lot of private lands that are between the public lands. And that's what initiated the current fight. Probably or possibly because of the political opposition, they changed the map a couple times now. And the current map, if you believe that that is the final decision, says that the state park and the national park will only have detection technology, but the private lands between them and the private lands upstream are still in the cross-eye for the wall itself. From a legal perspective, there is no vote in Congress here. This is a decision made by the Department of Homeland Security. And They have the authority under existing federal law to waive almost every other law that would normally be an impediment, such as National Environmental Policy Act, National Historic Preservation Act, all requirements for public involvement, all requirements for transparency on contracting. And they have done that from the middle of the state park, just above a big canyon upstream. And that's still the state of play. So from a legal perspective, provided that law holds up, and it is being challenged by Lake and Jordahl's group that you spoke with in the previous episode, provided that law holds up, they have the authority to do it. And so the decision, keep Big Bend wild, and I think most of the others in the coalition believe, is one that will be made behind closed doors and will be made through political influence. And so we and others are urging people to contact Governor Abbott in Texas, even though he has no formal role here. One phone call from the governor to the White House saying, "You're killing us. This is going to cause us to lose the midterms." And maybe that call's already happened. We don't know, and we probably never will know. We are talking and encouraging people to talk to their members of Congress, Republicans in particular, frankly, but even people in Democratic districts. Congress's congeniality is not what it once was, but there are a few Democrats and Republicans that do actually talk to one another. And we're talking to as many of them as we can. We've been up to Capitol Hill, and what's really remarkable is that people are listening to us on both sides of the aisle. And one of the people who is leading this effort, I mentioned, is a sheriff from the adjoining county, Terrell County. He and I testified before Congress a little more than a year ago on opposite teams about border security. And that's when we first met. We never met in the 5 years I spent at Big Bend. But we exchanged business cards, and we actually listened to what the other said, and we probably agreed on 80% of what we were saying. It was clear he loved the land as much as I do. And he said, even though that bill was not about a wall, he said he was opposed to a wall. So we are allies now, and I asked him to introduce me to his contacts on the Republican side in Congress, which he did. And so when I went there, I think the staffers were really pretty amazed that people who had been on opposite teams before were totally allied at this point. So at this point, we don't know really what the state of play is. Nobody, I think, is confident that the colors on the map will not change in the absence of some really definitive statement from someone high enough to be credible. And we don't know if that will ever happen, to be perfectly honest. And so we may win this fight and not know when we've won. That's the challenge.
Right. The lack of transparency is a real issue. So
Yes.
Yeah.
In everything that's happening on public lands right now.
Right.
You mentioned private lands as a piece of this puzzle. We've seen a lot of reporting about the national park, some reporting about the state park. I think the private land piece has been a little bit underreported, maybe. Can you tell us a little more how private lands fit into this? Is there any opposition coming from ranchers and private landowners?
The opposition from the private landowners is huge, and in some ways may be more substantial, or at least may be more significant in terms of influence than, frankly, what the public environmental community is interested in. So many of the ranchers are speaking out. A billionaire owner of a major ranch, as well as most of the tourist infrastructure in the gateway town of Marathon, Marathon, Texas, has come out against. We have been encouraging to the degree we can make connections. Some of the large ranchers are also very large Republican donors. And so we think there's a tremendous amount of behind the scenes stuff that even those of us on the inside of the coalition really are not fully aware of. But we talk about transparency. The other thing that's been really offensive to local people has been the very heavy-handed approach of some of the contractors. To the best of anyone's knowledge, there is no authority yet to trespass on private land. But yet contractors are putting out survey stakes, sending out letters, threatening condemnation. And so I think even people that might have been more sympathetic to the wall are just grossly offended at the approach that's been taken. And a few people in Homeland Security have spoken out locally. We don't know if they really have the authority to do so or whether they are telegraphing which direction, from or to Washington. We're not sure. But some of them have said we've told people to stand down until this is resolved. But when asked, so will there be a border wall here or not? No one will speak definitively. What they're saying is there is currently no plan. And frankly, currently no plan is not very convincing.
Right. We have the concepts of a plan, as the president
Right.
has said. I mean, I find it interesting as someone who spent the first half of my career in the public land space trying to counter arguments that just national monument designations were somehow a land grab. You now actually have the Department of Homeland Security with an actual land grab saying eminent domain is somehow in play now for the border wall. That just kind of blows my mind. I do want to get a sense, how are folks doing inside the park? I mean, Big Bend, I tend to think of as one of the quieter parks in terms of making news, considering the size of it and its impact on the park system. Are the folks who work there doing all right, suddenly being at the forefront of a national conversation?
I think they would just as soon it all go away. When I was superintendent, it was generally fairly quiet, but I always knew that the border issue could be one that showed up on the front page of the Washington Post the following day. It never did. I was glad. But, even in the Biden administration, there was just this real nervousness about everything Mexico. And even though we were doing some terrific transboundary conservation work, it almost felt like I needed to ask permission before I used the word Mexico in a sentence in public.
Sure.
But I have connections still in the park, and I don't want to betray any of those folks at this point because they are really unable to speak, and they're unable to take positions. I mean, federal agencies normally don't take positions on controversial issues, even in less fraught times. But this is a difficult place for people to be at. Keep Big Bend Wild actually did what we call a First Amendment event, probably the first one ever in the history of the park. I applied for a permit of the things that I never had to sign when I was the superintendent. And we did a little tabling exercise right in front of the visitor center about 3 or 4 weeks ago, seeing hundreds of people during spring break, the busiest time of the year. And virtually everyone was really concerned about this. But I had suggested quietly behind the scenes to park staff, don't anybody come see us in uniform because you don't want to be photographed next to us, even though
Sure.
we're your friends. But we were also saying to people, as they were passing us on the way to the visitor center in the bathrooms, say, come speak to us when you're done with your important business because we can tell you things that nobody inside the building can talk about. So I think, my impression is that, I don't want to speak for every employee and that every employee has the same political views, but I think they're glad that the public is rallying to support what they are working and given their lives to protect. But I will also say that the Park Service as a whole, as you both know, is incredibly under duress. It's down more than 25% in staff. Big Bend is part of that. Big Bend has 3 of the 5 division chief positions vacant. The superintendent job has been vacant a couple times since I left. They just hired my former deputy, which is great news, but now the deputy position is vacant. Lots of the staff are doing jobs that the Secretary of the Interior has insisted that visitor services are more important than everything else. So we have a geologist serving as the chief of interpretation. We have biologists working the visitor centers right now. They only recently hired someone to work on the road crew. They had no road crew for most of the last 2 years. So the park and every national park is really hurting right now. And so if there's one thing I urge people to do, wall or no wall, Big Bend or no wall, but thank any Park Service employee you see in uniform for what they're doing right now. It's
Yes.
tough.
Definitely thank your friendly neighborhood park ranger the next chance you get. So I had a question because most of the states we cover are sort of the Intermountain West, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, etc. Texas is a little bit different than those states because there's actually not very much public land. And so I'm curious, how does that play out in the attitudes of the people who visit one of the few public lands they can at Big Bend National Park? And how do Texans think about public lands?
Texans realize there are very few public lands in the state. And of course, it's the history of how Texas came into the nation, which is more time than we have today. But Big Bend National Park alone is about 20% of all the publicly accessible land in the state. There are 17 or 18 national park units, believe it or not, in Texas. All of the other national park units would fit inside Big Bend, leaving enough room for all of the state parks as well. And so between Big Bend National Park and Big Bend Ranch State Park, which is nearby and the largest state park, that's 27% of the publicly accessible land in the state. And I say publicly accessible because military lands are technically public, but you can't go on them.
Right.
There's a lot of military land in the state. Texans love Big Bend. And in fact, it's a great origin story because the legislation came about in the 1930s in the middle of the Depression. And Texans wanted a national park that rivaled those big ones out west. They found the place that they thought would be most credible, and that was what is now Big Bend National Park. And Congress passed the bill fairly easily, but said, okay, Texas, you want a national park, you buy it and donate it to the National Park Service. And so that took 9 years during the Depression to do it. It wasn't dedicated until 1944. And Texans call Big Bend Texas's gift to the nation. Texans are really proud of their public land. The other thing that's really interesting, I had listened to your podcast a few weeks ago with the Jonathan Klein from Ride Apart talking about motorsports. One of the big uses of Big Bend National Park, there's 181 miles of dirt roads, most of which are rough four-wheel drive roads. And that is one of the few places that you can do that in the state of Texas. So provided people stay on the road, as rough as it is, we don't like the term off-road at all. It's a great use of the national park.
Off-highway being the term now, right?
Yes.
Exactly. That's the better term. And so Big Bend attracts an incredible diversity of users. West Texas is dominated by oil and gas, of course, not close to Big Bend, but Midland, Odessa is only 4 hours away. And where do oil and gas people go to recreate? Many of them go to Big Bend National Park. So I think that also speaks to why this coalition is so broad-based, because people love the park. You don't have to be an environmentalist or a bird watcher or a hiker or a progressive to love the public lands. And I think Texas, with so few of them, really people appreciate that. And that also, I think, feeds into the potential for very good things coming from legislation that may result from all of this.
While we're watching all of that, what's the best way for folks to keep plugged into what is going on through your group, through other members of this coalition, if they want to learn more or just check in on the park? Where should they go?
Well, I'd say three places. Checking in on the park, the NPS website is probably the best place, nps.gov/BIBE. Keep Big Bend Wild, our website is keepbigbendwild.org. And while we have made no attempt to keep up with the current status of the wall, because that changes more than our small group can keep up with, we are posting news and updates on media that is covering it, and that's a good place. But if you just do a web search or social media search for Big Bend Wall, there is a ton of stuff out there right now. I think the challenge is, as I said earlier, there's no one in charge. And social media is interesting because there are people who will say, there's never been a wall proposed in Big Bend. You have to take that with a grain of salt. But I will say that, in terms of the status of the wall fight, Big Bend Wild is not really, as I said, our bandwidth is small. Our ability to have the latest breaking news is not there, but we will have where's the status of the fight. As I said, I'm very optimistic that we'll beat the wall, at least in the state and national parks and the Wild and Scenic River downstream. And my hope is that people will stay tuned and keep involved in the coalition to permanently protect the place. I do think those private lands are much more vulnerable right now. It's not my personal expertise as having been a public land manager my entire career, and it's not Keep Big Bend Wild's focus, but we certainly have the concerns that those folks share. And any border wall upstream Also has a potential impact on the protected lands downstream in terms of flooding and wildlife and debris and even lighting. So we're watching that one carefully as well.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. And we'd love to have you back on when things develop. If there's good news, if there's bad news. Bob Krumenaker, thanks for joining us on The Landscape.
Well, thank you, Lily. Thank you, Aaron. I would love to be back and talk about a Big Bend wilderness bill sometime in 2027. Let's hope that we can
Yes.
be doing that.
Fingers crossed.
We will look forward to that. Thank you, Bob.
Great.
And some good news, right over the hill from where I am taping today, Jefferson County Open Space just acquired 347 acres of land adjacent to Red Rocks Park near Morrison, expanding the already popular Matthews Winters Park to the west. That parcel was known as Braun Ranch. It's been on the market for a couple of years. Developers were circling. Then the Conservation Fund stepped in. Great Outdoors Colorado kicked in $2 million, and the deal closed last week for just over $7 million in total. The new land connects two currently disconnected sections of the park. It sits along an elk and mule deer migration corridor, and it tops out more than 1,000 feet above the Morrison Valley, with views all the way out to Mount Blue Sky. Jeffco does plan to build some new trails there. There's no timeline yet, but the land is protected, and I, for one, can't wait to get out there. Well, that will do it for this episode of The Landscape. If you enjoyed us, please go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening to us. Do go follow us on X, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. We're probably out there posting something right now. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks a lot to Bob Krumenaker for joining us to talk about Big Bend. Thanks to Lilly for joining us. Kate will be back next week. We're going to have a sad episode. It's us saying goodbye to our fearless leader, Jen Rokola, as she steps down from CWP after 11 years. In the meantime, thank you for listening to The Landscape.